Good morning. Welcome to the USJI seminar on the topic of the US pivot to Asia and Japan, China, and Korea. How can new leaders in Northeast Asia maintain the regional peace? I'm Katsuichi Uchida, president of this USJI, US-Japan Research Institute, and also the vice president of Waseda University. And the USJI was established in the March 2009 by 8 leading Japanese universities, namely Dosha, Keio, Kyoto, Nichimekan, Tokyo, Tsukuba, and Waseda universities. And also USJI is supported by both Japanese and US business societies. And the purpose of USJI is to dispatch the policy-related research results to wider communities, especially to the United States. And we continuously held USJI Week twice a year, usually in March and September. This year, this week, we have already finished 4 events, and on food, environment, and disaster resilience, and with regard to the Korean Peninsula. Today and tomorrow, we have 2 seminars on each day. And today, we are very fortunate to have very distinguished guests, distinguished speakers on China, Japan, and Korea. And also, I found many specialists in this participation list. So we are able to expect the fruitful and productive and interesting discussions among panelists, and also between audience and panelists as well. And the moderator of today's seminar is Professor Terada of Dosha University. I'd like to welcome Professor Terada.
Thank you very much, Professor Uchida. Very good morning. And first of all, thank you very much for gathering for our seminar today. My name is Trilateral from Dosha University. Well, actually, I have participated in a number of the USJI events, but as a Waseda faculty before. So in this case, I remember a couple of times, I made this kind of speech after Professor Uchida's greetings and on a couple of occasions. But I'm quite happy to join USJI this time as a Dosha faculty. Dosha just joined USJI last year, so I hope the university's collaboration based upon the USJI has been more developed. And well, today and also tomorrow, USJI and also for WOJUS. WOJUS means Waseda University Organization for US-Japan Relations. It's sort of the Waseda's counter organization towards USJI. And WOJUS and USJI a couple of times have collaborated to create some of the research projects, and one of which is actually today's and tomorrow's seminars. So it's sort of this 2 series. And today we try to focus more on the economic side of what we call CJK, which stands for China, Japan, Korea, or Northeast Asia relations, or regionalism. There are 3 variables coming to my mind when I organizing these 2 seminars. First of all, again, security Asia or economy Asia, this is sort of the debate currently going on, started by foreign policy article. Of course, security Asia tried to more looking at the negative or dark side of the relationships, but most of you here are strongly aware. China-Japan relationship is probably a classic example. We have a number of tensions on history, territory, even the politicians, statesmen. In last week, as you know, Mr. Abe was here. and one of the major American newspapers interviewed him. And China's newspapers starkly criticizing, one of his comments regarding Senkaku or the Islands. But anyway, that's one of the many, many examples on the China-Japan's dark side of relationships. Korea-Japan's no exception. Even North Korea's announced nuclear development, and which suddenly affected the United States foreign policy to Northeast Asia as well. But on the other hand, CJK have developed a quite variety of the cooperative frameworks. We have 18 ministerial meetings, including summits. And every year, so CJK leaders have met twice a year. But last year, actually one which was cancelled because of the Senkaku dispute. Nevertheless, trade ministers gathered to announce the launch of FTA, Free Trade Agreement. And the first negotiation just started this year. Investment treatment was already signed. So in this case, while we have a quite number of tensions, disputations among three nations, including Taiwan and North Korea, we have also a quite prosperous future in terms of regional integration among three neighboring countries in Northeast Asia. So how actually we can characterize these kind of two opposing trends that are happening in Northeast Asia? This is one thing. And second trend is more domestic politics. All leaders in three nations changed over the last half a year. For North Korea's Ms. Park's inauguration was just done this week. And as you know, Mr. Abe just came here after he took the position 2 months ago, Prime Minister. And Mr. Xi actually also came to China's leadership. So we have all new leaders in three Northeast Asian countries. And how did the change of governments or new leaders try to consider the China-Japan-Korea relationships? And how the change of government affected the domestic politics, which also have a huge impact on their own economic trade or fiscal investment policies. And of course, my own interest is, our own interest in this seminar is the, of course, CJK integration, cooperation, more economic sides, more prosperous or more positive sides of relationships. And finally, yes, this is Washington, D.C. We have to consider the United States. And now the Mr. Obama won the second election, and the so-called Asia pivot or rebalancing of his foreign policy. How the second Obama administration developed the Asia pivot, and particularly the second Obama administration's views and policy stances over the CJK cooperation. This is a very significant issue. And particularly this is my interest why we are organizing this kind of panel in Washington, D.C. Because we are also happy to receiving feedbacks from American colleagues here. And then probably we can come back to here after getting the sort of screening the sort of argument back in Tokyo. So it's sort of the continuous event which I would like to kick off today for the Obama and CJK. So this is the topic of this seminar, and also background information. And in order to do that, we have a very privilege to have three distinguished scholars and experts from right to left from me, Professor Chopper from University of Virginia. And Professor Chopper kind of came to us last November to give a talk for our annual symposium on the regional integration. Professor Chopper is well known, especially on Japanese politics and US-Japan relationships. Particularly his works on the sort of guidance or structured development initiative talks are well reported. So I'm very happy to be able to meet today. And then the Mike Martin, and welcome back to USJI events. He's a specialist in Asian affairs and Congress research services, and mainly on the economic side. And Dr. Martin just served as a discussant for my seminar last year on TPP and Japan. Again, this was well received, particularly by audience, mainly thanks to the marked the feedbacks and comment. And again, TPP, as you know, Mr. Abe, after meeting Mr. Obama last week, now Japanese politics is moving quite quickly at the moment, to consider the potential participation, hopefully as quickly as possible in the TPP. And Mike is actually a specialist on China and Hong Kong and also studying more economic side. So I'm very pleased to have him today. And finally, Professor Junior Nishino from Keio University, and currently based in the Wilson Center for International Studies, as well as the Gatton Sigurd Center, the GW. I'm sure he has been joining his own sabbatical based in Washington, D.C. Through the connections with such major international organizations like Wilson Center and the Sigurd Centers. Professor Nishino is a well-known specialist on the Korean studies as well, and he often goes to Seoul to get the first-hand information on what's going on. And so we have been working quite often together, even back in Tokyo. So again, I'm very happy to see him in Washington, D.C. to get what he gets from his studies in Washington. So each speaker has 20 minutes at maximum for their presentation. And then probably touch on or intervene sometimes through my own somewhat nasty or beautiful comments sometimes. I hope all of them will be back to my own questions. And then we try to open the Q&A to the floor after that to have more fruitful discussions with all of you here today. So let me introduce Professor Liu Shoupe, University of Arizona, for his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Terada's comments mentioned CJK a great deal, and I'm trusting the other panelists will talk a lot about the CJK regional cooperation opportunities. I'm going to focus my remarks on the America's TPP, as the title of this session refers to it. I'm not quite comfortable with that way of phrasing things. TPP is a venture that involves, from the beginning, not just the United States, but Asian countries, including New Zealand, Asia-Pacific countries, including New Zealand, Chile, Vietnam, Malaysia, and recently Canada and Mexico. It's a project that now includes a lot of the major players in the Asia-Pacific region. And the United States certainly has been exercising some leadership, but it's a multilateral negotiation. Anything that comes out of it is going to involve all of the countries coming to a common agreement. Today I'm going to focus on the recent developments in the Prime Minister Abe's decision-making, some of the signals that are coming out every day from Japan that, yes, Japan is about to announce it will join the TPP talks. And so I'll review a little bit of that recent development and then focus most of my comments on trying to analyze why. Why exactly is it that at this particular moment, after much delay and lots of back and forth, the Japanese finally seem to be deciding that they want to join this set of talks. So just to get you the basic chronology, it's now been over 3 years since the United States and several smaller economies in the Asia-Pacific launched their conversation about creating a trans-Pacific partnership. From the beginning, this has been envisioned as a high-quality free trade and economic partnership deal that would integrate the United States economy more deeply with the economies in this Asian-Pacific region. It has been about 2 years since the Obama administration began to conceive of the pivot towards Asia, involving on the security side, moving more forces into the region, but from the beginning conceiving of this also as something that needed to happen on the economic side, and the TPP being the primary policy initiative that the Obama administration could point to, where the United States was reaching out to the Asia-Pacific economies to pivot economically toward that region. And from about that period, the United States has been signaling the Japanese that they would be welcome to join, or they wanted to talk to Japan about joining. It's always been kind of a delicate dance. Some people in Congress were not as enthusiastic about this. There had to be some conversation about a variety of issues. But the administration has been sending signals for quite some time now that they would welcome Japan's participation. It's now been 16 months since Prime Minister Noda signaled his interest in bringing Japan into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was prior to the Asia-Pacific regional meetings in November 2011. Since then, Japan has been inching, so it was interested 16 months ago. It's taken it 16 months to get to the point where it is about to join the talks. When Japan announced its interest in joining the TPP talks, when Prime Minister Noda made this announcement in November 2011, it immediately sparked interest in a number of other countries. Among these were Mexico and Canada. And it's interesting that they were able to very quickly start talking with the existing TPP partners and getting their agreement to come into the negotiations, to the point that they were able to join the December session of the TPP talks. Meanwhile, Japan now has only a very narrow window in which it can announce its plan to join and move towards joining. The reason is because there is a 90-day notice that has to be provided to Congress that the United States wishes to engage Japan in these negotiations before it can actually begin those negotiations. So what that means is that even if Abe were to announce tomorrow that he will bring Japan into the talks, Japan is going to miss the March negotiations and the May negotiations, because the soonest Japan could come in to the conversation would be in June, and the next scheduled session after that is not till September. And all of this is supposed to wrap up by the end of the year. So Japan has delayed to the point where it now will have only a very brief period, if it takes this step, between roughly June and the end of the year to negotiate all the issues that it cares about and try to shape the agreement in a way that will be in Japan's national interest. So nevertheless, despite the fact that this has been dragged out over such a long period of time, and Japan has waited to the very last minute, over the last week, Abe has been sending very clear signals that he will finally bring Japan into the talks. The first really clear signal was the way he trumpeted the written agreement he secured from the Obama administration during his recent visit to the United States. So let me read from the joint statement that was written down at the insistence of the Japanese. Recognizing that both countries have bilateral trade sensitivities, such as certain agricultural products for Japan and certain manufactured products for the United States, the two governments confirm that as the final outcome will be determined during the negotiations, it is not required to make a prior commitment to unilaterally eliminate all tariffs upon joining the TPP negotiations. So Abe and his supporters have been claiming ever since this document was written that this is a major concession by the United States, and that this should reassure Japanese farmers and other concerned interest groups that Japan will not have to give away the store, including 0% tariffs on rice, through the TPP process. The implication has been that Japan now has a green light that it will be able to carve out rice in these talks. If you look at the actual language, though, there is no such commitment. Right? The actual language says Japan does not have to give away everything before the negotiations start. The key phrase is the final outcome will be determined during the negotiations. So that still leaves on the table, in my opinion, all of the issues that the sensitive interest groups in Japan care about. But I think Abe is on to something in the sense that this is a signal that he's going to bargain hard within TPP for Japan's national interests. So he was able to show the Japanese farmers that he could convince the Obama administration to make this concession, albeit not a very big one, suggesting that during the talks he'll be able to do something similar and maybe actually carve out rice in that agreement or some other sensitive sectors. So everybody in Japan who speaks for the Abe administration seems to be on the same page in the last few days. It's quite unusual to hear so many different parts of the LDP and so many different bureaucracies and interest groups saying that this is a key concession that opens the door for Japan to join the TPP talks. Various party organs, including representatives of the Komeito coalition partner and the groups representing the LDP party organizations, have started to give the go-ahead for the Prime Minister to enter these talks. Recent statements have said it's okay to go into the talks as long as the Prime Minister looks after Japan's national interest. Okay? This is, in their usage, code word for Japan protecting the rice market and other sensitive sectors. But nevertheless, although it has this proviso, the groups seem to be opening the door for Abe to make this decision. Finally, Abe has been telling the media that he will make an announcement any day now, as early as March, which could be tomorrow, but might be next week. With this much buildup, it would be very awkward for him to pull back. It's really hard to imagine how he could do that without losing a lot of face. So it looks like Japan is coming into the talks, and I want to spend the rest of my time thinking about why it's doing that. Why is Japan suddenly entering the talks that everyone knows will force the nation to open up its most sensitive sectors of the economy, or at least most of them, under an LDP government that owes its persistent hold on power to the support of farmers and many other protected segments of the economy? Anybody who's followed Japanese trade policy for any length of time has to be struck by what an unusual move this is for the government to sign on to a set of talks that's very likely to lead to sharp liberalization of agricultural trade in Japan. And my answer, in brief, is that Japan has reached a crossroads where it cannot afford to be left out of the TPP. It is clearer today than it ever was that it is in Japan's national interest to join these talks. And by national interest, I mean not the interest of Japan's farmers, but the interests of the whole nation in peace and prosperity. So let me just focus on how the TPP talks are starting to be seen in Japan as a critical part of both security policy and economic policy. So on the security side, Japan has been increasingly aware in the last year of its vulnerability to rising Chinese military power and persistent Chinese nationalism. I think maybe at first people in Japan hoped this issue would flare up and then die down the way it has at different times in the past, but there's no sign that the Senkaku Diaoyu Island dispute is going to go away or die down. It's going to be a simmering source of tension for some time, and I think Japanese policymakers are coming to terms with that. As long as China knows that the United States stands behind Japan's claim to these islands, it will limit its provocations. And it certainly has been engaged in some provocations, but it's kept them short of the point that would trigger any hostilities. In large part because the United States has been sending clear signals that it doesn't want this to escalate. If it were to escalate, it would take Japan's side. But given Japan's dependence on the United States in this conflict, it means Japan needs to reinforce its ties with its ally, including through increased economic integration. The TPP is an obvious way to do this, and I'm sure that this is one of the big reasons Abe has stepped up to lead Japan into these talks. For Abe, at least, I think this national security reason is particularly important. But in the long term, as the Chinese economy grows to become 2 and then 3 times larger than Japan, even the combined military strength of the US and Japan in the region won't be sufficient to hold off Chinese power. Unless China is discouraged from pursuing such an aggressive policy, by its calculations of the economic costs it would pay if it tried to use force to settle territorial disputes. So in the long term, the real real interest of Japan in TPP ought to lie in the potential it holds to bring China into increased economic integration and through creating a lot more mutual interdependence, raise the economic costs of any country using force to settle territorial disputes or other disputes. So Japan therefore has an interest in being on the ground floor of what is looking likely to become the biggest economic partnership agreement in the region and potentially the world if it eventually includes China. I know it isn't particularly appealing to refer to the EU as a model these days, but it is useful to step back and appreciate what that economic union has done to promote peace in the region. So yes, they're having some troubles over the currency union, but long before they took that step, the economic union that they built, the free trade area, all the other economic harmonizations, agreements that they were signed, were critical to increasing mutual dependence to such a level in Europe that no one is talking about settling any territorial disputes there through force. And I think the TPP has the potential over decades to play a similar role in the region in Japan. I think at least some people in Japan, economic elites, trade officials, are thinking about the TPP in these terms. Of course, the TPP will not include China in the short term, and some people are looking at it as an economic organization that will contain China. But I think that Asian members in particular, and this would include Japan, do not want it to become an anti-Chinese economic zone. China is all of these countries' most important customer. The plan of the TPP is to create a high-quality economic partnership agreement and then invite China to join. And this won't happen quickly, but especially if Japan joins and participates with other countries that share this interest, like Australia and Malaysia and Vietnam, and potentially Korea if it were to come into the TPP. All of these countries are not wanting the TPP to become an anti-Chinese zone, and it has the potential to really create a community that includes China. So I'm not sure this particular motive has a whole lot to do with Abe's thinking on this issue, so I don't want to overstate things. But this is a broader move that's happened over the last year or two towards joining the TPP. METI officials and MOFA officials and many other economic interest groups have come in this direction, in part because of, I think, their long-range thinking about the potential to promote peace through economic interaction. So then let me turn to the economic interests behind this move. So after 2 decades of stagnation, the Japanese economy is shrinking again, if you've seen the latest GDP figures, and suffering from deflation. Abe is intent on leading Japan out of its deflationary slump through unconventional monetary policy and what some would call fiscal profligacy, even in the face of massive debt. But his economic advisors know that short-term monetary and fiscal stimulus will be wasted unless the nation finds a way to boost productivity. So this is a well-known story, you've heard it many places here in Washington, about how the demographic shift happening in Japan is creating a reliance on productivity growth as the only source of increasing economic growth in the country. The population of workers is on course to shrink by 30 million workers by 2050. It's already been shrinking for about a decade, and it's going to start shrinking more quickly. And during this period, if Japan wants to continue to have its economy grow, it's going to need to increase productivity. And Abe has been talking about structural reform as one of the pillars of his Abenomics, the monetary, fiscal, and structural reform, but he hasn't been able to offer very much detail on what this is composed of. And part of the reason is because the Japanese political system, and I can elaborate on this in the Q&A if you're interested, the Japanese political system has continued to be dominated by bureaucrats, politicians and interest groups who have very close ties to the protected segments of the economy, including the farmers. And it makes it very difficult for Japan, on its own initiative, to say, we're going to liberalize these sectors for our own reasons to make the economy grow. They used to rely on gaiatsu from the United States. When the US was able to use Super 301 and other more unilateral aggressive means, the Japanese could say, we have to respond to that. That doesn't work anymore because of WTO rules and the fact that Japan relies less on the United States and more on China. But the one thing I would propose, the one kind of an agreement that could bring about the liberalization that Japan needs, is a large trade deal with multiple partners. And FTAs one at a time with Singapore, Mexico. These are not going to bring out the export-oriented interests in Japan, the big business groups who have a stake in increasing exports and are the allies of moves to liberalize the Japanese economy. The only way to get them out is to have a big show like TPP that in a brief period of time puts the pressure on Japan to open up its economy in order to gain access to lots of other countries. So because of time constraints, I won't be able to talk very much detail about the economic losses Japan is trying to avoid, but I do want to acknowledge, although I emphasize the positive here of how the TPP can be really good for Japan and its economic growth, another important consideration for Abe is the alternative. What's the alternative to joining the TPP? Staying out? If the TPP actually comes to an agreement this year, at the end of the year, and Chorus continues to develop, Japanese corporations are going to be at a disadvantage operating in a region where most of the other countries are part of these free trade networks. Japan will face pressure at that point to join, and it will have a take it or leave it deal. It will have to agree to whatever the TPP has become. So compared to that, it seems advantageous to Abe to join these talks now and possibly carve out something that he can point to the farmers and say, we did our best. And I think that he won't be able he won't be able to negotiate a deal that protects the farmers so much that it takes away the benefits of the trade liberalization that Japan will enjoy. So he can argue it on one side that this is good for Japan, while suggesting to the farmers that he's going to be able to carve out their areas that are of greatest interest to them, and he will be able to sustain this about until July. Okay? Because Japan's not going to participate in the talks until June at the soonest. It can't announce any concessions before then. So July happens to be the month when Japan is having upper house elections, and once Abe gets through those elections, he will be able, with a greater level of support in the upper house, to face a period of 3 years with no elections in Japan, which is a very unusual window of opportunity to do something that's politically difficult. So Prime Minister with 70% support rates, with this kind of a window of opportunity, has seen that TPP not only is good for the country, but is something that his administration can pass without doing terrible damage to itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chopra, for wonderful and also very informative presentations focusing upon the TPP and Japan, including the recent Mr. Abe's visit to Washington, D.C., including also his own commentary on the visit. And again, well, just like you, I have a lot of questions, but maybe I should say only one question. It's especially from Japanese domestic politics. And also, as he mentioned, and TPP is not the only option for Japan in terms of the FTAs. CJK FTA, even East Asian FTA, by 16 countries, and also EU-Japan FTA. All of negotiations are supposed to start, and also already TPP started anyway, this year. So Japan is the actually only nation in the world who will have 4 or 5 major FTA negotiations this year. So my curiosity is, how this kind of FTA development will affect the upcoming House election. Election is always intervening the FTA policies or negotiations in Japan, mainly because of the politicians who need to protect the Japanese farmers for their victories in their constituencies, always working harder in election time. But still LDP is not necessarily joining a majority in upper house. So victory of an upper house is a must for Mr. Abe, probably to smoothly promote his own economic policy or Abenomics, something like that. So my question is how Mr. Abe, even saying yes, we can join the TPP, together with the other FTA negotiations, can mobilize overcome the Japanese long-term problem in terms of economic policy, the farmers or agriculture interest groups. So this is probably the most significant issue for Japan or Mr. Abe to win the election and to promote negotiations. How do you find the prospect of that? So maybe after that.
After that, okay.
Please consider.
Right.
Yeah, we're listening to other speakers. Again, next, Dr. Mark Martin on probably China and also CJK, or even he might say something on the China's views on the TPP or anything. Okay, Mark.
Thank you. I'm going to speak from here, if that's okay, rather than. Well, thank you to USJI, to Waseda University, to Uchida Sensei and Sarada Sensei for this opportunity to speak. I was asked to speak primarily about China, so although I don't look it, I'm going to take sort of a Chinese perspective on the content for today. And I'm going to probably, in the course of my presentation, say some things intentionally a bit provocative, but maybe a bit contrarian, either to the perspective we've already heard. Actually, the old notion that all politics is local. And therefore, although we're looking at an international issue, regional economic integration, I think the primary drivers behind it are domestic ones and local ones. And in the case of China particularly, and arguably in contrast to some of the other countries, China has taken to heart this notion that they need to restructure their economy. It's incorporated in the 12 five-year plan. It's part of the economic policy that's been agreed by the leadership, that they want to promote greater consumption, restructure investment so it's more rational, reduce their dependence, which sometimes is overstated, on export-driven growth, that they have taken to heart the notion they need to make some changes. And therefore the question becomes, how do they relate to the international community in light of the changes they're making domestically? The other thing that is another key component in that domestic reform is they see greater international competition that's going to force them, if they want to work in the global market, up the value chain, as we tend to say, so that they can no longer produce the rather easily or readily manufactured commodities. They're going to have to put more value into the products that they're going to globally produce. And a third element that I think often gets overlooked is internally inside the country, growing consideration that the regional unequal development, the rural-urban unequal development, even the emergence of a wealthy class, and not the emergence to the degree that they thought of a middle class in China, has become a domestic political issue. So the overall economic policies of China, I think, I would argue, are reflecting these domestic drivers, and they're now looking globally on what to do about that. Second, that while we are focusing on CJK and TPP and RCEP and all the different alphabet soups of potential formal trade structures that could be organized, I don't think China looks at it just in terms of a formal trade structure. I would say that there's a multifaceted process that China has been actively going on in terms of forming the global market and having an impact on the nature of the global market that has been taking place for a number of years. First, the rapid expansion of its bilateral trade relations throughout the region and globally. China has emerged over the last 20 years as the leading trading partner for more and more economies, in many cases usurping the United States. That's happened without these formal trade agreements existing. And similarly, China has been the recipient of a lot of foreign direct investment from overseas, part of its engine of rapid economic growth. Again, taking place without the existence of these formal institutions. China has also been very active in bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. According to the Asia Development Bank and its research institute, China has 12 existing FTAs and is negotiating 6 right now. There's over 100 of these trade agreements in the Asia region alone at this point, without the completion of the TPP, without the completion of the CJK, without the completion of RCEP. So that's been going on. Third, there's been a lot of foreign direct investment going on back and forth in the region. Major Japanese companies have a presence in mainland China. Major Taiwanese companies have presence. Major Korean companies have a presence in China. Of recent years, that's been declining. There's been a slowdown in foreign direct investment inside China, and you're now seeing China talk about being outwardly foreign direct investments, that their companies are going to set up operations overseas. In fact, the United States and Europe are emerging as greater recipients of Chinese foreign direct investment, challenging a dynamic that had been going on for a number of years. And the last part, I think that's part of this multifaceted, I'm going to go over each one of them a little bit more, is the promotion of the renminbi as a regional currency. Now, I look out at the audience, I suspect a number of you have traveled out in Asia over the last few years. And I think it's not coincidental that when you go to a 4-star and a 5-star hotel in Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia, and you go to the concierge desk where you used to exchange money, and it used to say dollar, euro, Japanese yen, you're now seeing renminbi. The renminbi is now more on a retail level accepted as a currency. China has been very actively promoting the greater usage of renminbi in the commercial sector as well. So my quick summary of a very short presentation is that China sees, in my mind, RCEP, TPP, CJK as part of a larger overall strategy in terms of its relationship in the region, not as the end-all or be-all, or even necessarily the primary goal of what they're trying to do. It might be nice, it might be helpful, but it's only one prong of what they're trying to do. Let me talk a little bit more about this. I've already talked about the expansion of the bilateral trade flows, and there's a number of issues and some statistics, let's set that aside. But I think the other part that often gets missed in the academic community and in the government community is that a lot of manufacturing now taking place in Asia is multi-country. That the goods that are coming out of Asia, although we attribute one country of origin to the final good or product, are being done by 10 countries sometimes or more. There was a recent study that I have not seen the full report on that said, for example, in clothing imports coming to the United States, 70% of the value is actually originates in the United States, even though it's an imported good from overseas. So this activity, these bilateral trade flows have been growing, becoming very complex, very ornate in supply chains without the formal existence of these trade agreements. Let me turn to those trade agreements. Already pointed out there's over 100 of them flowing around. They're being signed. What a lot of people forget, though, or don't know, is that they're not being fully utilized. A study that was done again by the Asia Development Bank in terms of companies, whether or not they take benefit of a trade preference made available by a trade agreement, found that the utilization rate was 20%. In other words, 4 out of 5 times, they could have traded the good at a lower tariff rate or under better conditions. They chose not to. So free trade agreements are themselves at times very problematic. When you talk to the commercial sector and you ask them why, they say, well, in Cantonese they say homafan. Basically, it's difficult to process the paperwork to get access to the benefits. They're complex agreements. It's just easier to do the trade straight up. Then the question becomes, why negotiate these bilateral and multilateral trade agreements? And here's where, trained as an economist, I'm going to turn things around a little bit on the seminar. I think, as the previous speaker sort of presented, I think it has to do more with geopolitics and security issues. That the structure of having a formal trade agreement with other countries strengthens political ties, provides greater back support, as well as protects the domestic economy better than not having them. And I would argue that in China right now, that is part of their motivation. That trying to get into formal trade agreement is more focused on security concerns than necessarily the measured out economic benefits of the trade agreements. But we can come back to that. Real quick, a little bit on TPP versus RCEP. It's interesting when I'm here in the United States, or CJK, there's a tendency to focus on TPP as if it came out of nowhere, in the absence of any counterpoint. Yet when you're in Asia, there's a recognition that the notion of a larger regional trade agreement, ASEAN +3, ASEAN +6, now RCEP, as well as CJK, has been around for a number of years. And so there are some feelings in the United States that the TPP was a response to a feeling of it being contained. That is to say, the United States being excluded from an emerging regional trade bloc in Asia. And therefore, first the Bush administration, now the Obama administration have adopted the TPP as a way of making sure that the United States has a presence at the table for setting the rules and the procedures for trade flows in what is the fastest growing region of the world. So, of late you're hearing from China, they don't want to be, it goes back and forth. I won't go no further on that. Moving in then on to foreign direct investment, I talked very briefly about that. I think to a certain extent, one of the outstanding issues is whether or not the world is ready for Chinese outward foreign direct investment. Here in the United States, we had 2 distinct periods where we had a significant foreign direct investment. First, a flow from Japan. That didn't go over too well politically here, for those of us old enough to remember. But subsequently, Korea made major investments in the United States, and that went rather quietly. And time will tell how the United States responds to Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States. Last topic on the renminbi, I would say that this issue of trying to promote the regionalization of the renminbi goes all the way back. In China, memories don't go back just years, they go back decades, sometimes centuries, and sometimes millennia. And in this particular case, you cannot forget the Asian financial crisis of 1997, where much of Asia felt that the West left us, remember I'm taking a Chinese perspective, to our own devices to deal with the severe economic crisis. 2007 was seen in China as, oh my God, here we are once again in a situation where we cannot rely on Western financial institutions, Western economies, to be a stable source, a source of stability and security in the global context. So the idea that the renminbi could emerge as a regional currency, that China could export exchange rate risk, that its businesses would be operating in a preferential environment, much like US companies have since World War II, has an attractive feature to China. And so I would say that's part of how they see the context coming. And then real quick in my sort of scattershot approach, I think it's interesting that when we talk about Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang as the new leaders, and right now they're in this transition phase. They got their party positions, but they haven't gotten their government positions yet. That'll be coming in the next month, we presume. We do have the Boxilai incident, so that it's never 100% guaranteed that transitions will take place as expected. But I would argue that perhaps of the three leadership transitions that are taking place, this is the least significant. That in Chinese culture, the figures are generally go through an extended period of mentorship. When they emerge at the top, they need a few years to consolidate power and their responsibilities. But also in China, the formal, legal, written documents agreed to by the party, by the government, in some ways are more important than who's sitting in the office. So those documents are set for the next few years in terms of economic policies. And to a certain extent, it will be to Xi and Li to prove that they can fulfill and carry out those objectives that they've been given, that they've inherited from their previous leaders. It will take some time before them to actually start putting their own imprint on what's going to happen if they demonstrate that they are capable leaders in that particular period. I think I will stop there. I'm sort of throwing out some ideas in 15, 20 minutes for us to discuss a little bit later. A couple quick comments I would make. One, I thought it was interesting that to a certain extent we're operating under the assumption that a TPP agreement will be reached A, this year, or B, ever. And I think both of those are questions open for discussion and debate. And that's my final comment.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for interesting and on some occasion provocative presentations. And again, I highlighted the China's so-called multiple approaches to improving the economic conditions at home, and trade policy is just one of them, and also highlighting the quite other economic issues. I'm particularly struck by his touching on the RMB here, the monetary policies. Well, I didn't mention this point if I didn't consider informing this proposal for this panel. But you know, the financial cooperation is one of the few areas in which China and Japan have been cooperating. For example, in last year in Shanghai and Tokyo, they tried to start to exchange directly their own currencies without US dollars. Of course, US dollars are the key currencies. We have to always buy foreign currencies through the US dollar, especially when it comes to the investment and trade. But you know, China and Japan just agreed to open up the Shanghai and Tokyo market for the direct exchange of the currencies. That's suddenly affecting the global use of the US dollars. And this is sort of the approach that China has been utilizing. And this kind of the agreement China has already 17 countries, including most recent ones, Australia, one of the advanced nations and key allies of the United States. So my curiosity actually came from this point. How US actually has been seeing China such kind of financial cooperation policy or strategy, particularly to reduce its reliance on US dollars. And a couple of the developing countries or new emerging economies like Brazil and India also agreed on that. An interesting point is, for example, the 5 emerging countries just considering creating their own World Bank to utilize their own currencies rather than utilizing US dollars. So again, my question mark, how US or me or you yourself has been seeing this kind of China's behaviors in international financial strategies. And is this sort of a threat to US, or the US is actually willing to see the China's more liberalization of the currencies, etc. Okay, finally, I'd like to invite the Professor Jun Nishino, the Korean Studies Professor at the Keio University, and with more focus on the Korea and also CJK or other issues.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Trevor Sensei, for your kind introduction and invitation to this session. It's my pleasure to have an opportunity to participate in this event here at Washington, D.C., and I want to extend my thanks to USJI and Waseda University Organization for Japan-US Study. My task today is to speak about the regional strategy and the domestic adjustment program of new South Korean administration, Park Geun-hye government. Actually, I've been very interested in international relations surrounding the Korean Peninsula and have watched South Korean domestic affairs and foreign policy for around 20 years. When I studied at graduate school in Seoul, I got my PhD from Yonsei University in South Korea. I wrote my PhD thesis on South Korea's industrial policy making process and Japan ROK, Republic of Korea relations during Park Chung-hee period. So as you know, Park Chung-hee is a former South Korean president and the father of current president Park Geun-hye, and he ruled South Korea for 18 years. So given this background, Park Geun-hye administration will be the most important case study for me than any other president after the democratization of South Korea. So when thinking of Park Geun-hye's regional economic strategy, we should take into account three things, 3 points. Number one, the reality of South Korean economy. Number two, domestic problem, which President Park must address immediately. And number three, the recent geopolitical environment surrounding the Korean Peninsula. Firstly, as to the reality of South Korean economy, we know that the export has been the growth engine of South Korea since mid-1960s. It is the Park Chung-hee who is the founder of the current South Korea's export-oriented or export-dependent economic structure. And he had played a critical role for growing South Korea's big family business, known as chaebol. These big businesses, such as Samsung, LG, and Hyundai, or any other big businesses, have been key drivers for the country's economic rise over decades. These big businesses generate more than half the economy, half the country's gross domestic product. The former President Lee Myung-bak just stepped down, was the CEO of Hyundai Construction, Hyundai Consol, and during his presidency, he pushed business-friendly and export-driven policies, so given his experiences. Pursuing FTA, free trade agreement, is one of his core policy under the name of the Global Korea Strategy. South Korean government signed FTA with 45 countries, including FTA with the United States, European Union, and ASEAN by the end of 2012. And Seoul kicked off ROK China FTA negotiation last year and just ended preliminary talks for CJK free trade agreement last week. So these three countries, China, South Korea, and Japan, will hold the first round of negotiation in a couple of months, despite the tension on the territorial issues in the region. So generally speaking, existing and future FTAs will play a leading role in South Korea's future development in all economic sectors, despite the current uncertain economy situation. And given these realities, new South Korean president will basically continue to pursue her nation push her nation into global economy. But we have to pay attention to second point, domestic problem, domestic adjustment program, which new administration is facing. So there is a growing sense that the chaebol big business-dominated economic model development by Park Chung-hee is no longer working. And there is also increased criticism over allegation that the chaebol have hurt the growth of small and medium-sized firms in South Korea. In fact, the issue of so-called economic democratization in South Korean 경제 민주화, or in Japanese 계산 민주화, dominated last year's presidential election campaign. The opposition party candidate Moon Jae-in argued for regulatory cuts on chaebol ownership structures and the strong measures, while Park Geun-hye stressed fairness in market. In her inauguration address on Monday of this week, a couple of days ago, Park Geun-hye presented two-ways approach of a creative economy in Korean chanjo 경제 and Korean democratization as an answer to South Korea's economic problems. These were the core keywords in her presidential campaign platform last year. The first component, a creative economy, involved increasing value added by combining science technology and information technology IT sector with various other sectors to provide a new growth engine for national economy and new jobs, especially for young generations. She went to emphasize a lot of the newly created Ministry of Future Creation and Science, in Korean 미래 창조 과학부, in Japanese 미래 소조 과학부, as a driver for her new economy plan. Park also said economic democracy or economic democratization will have to be achieved for a creative economy to flourish. Park's conception of economic democracy will be defined as a fair market. She said that it means allowing large corporations and small and medium companies to prosper together through policies to foster small businesses so that anyone can rise if they work hard enough. And she also said it would involve rooting out the various unfair practices that frustrate small merchants and small businesses and correcting the mistakes of the past. Interestingly, she mentioned second miracle of the Han River, 한강의 기적, 4 times in her inauguration address. So Han River, miracle of Han River, is a symbolic word to express South Korea's economic success during Park Chung-hee period. But what she must address at this moment is to overcome or reconstruct her father's Park Chung-hee's legacy in her nation's economy in light of the polarization and the concentration of wealth at the top of the pyramid that South Korea is currently facing. As to FTA policy, given these visions of the new administrations, the transition team of Park Geun-hye announced its decision to spin off or transfer trade-related function from the Foreign Ministry to the Commerce Ministry. So this brought many opposition, and many officials have expressed doubt over the separation since then. But President Park Geun-hye has defended her decision, saying that trade is not just a matter of negotiation, but also an issue that needs careful follow-up measures for local industries. She also said reportedly that once trade is signed, we must promote our own industries in line with the treaty. So from her comments, we can see that the new president is cautiously paying attention to local industry in the age of globalization. Well, let's move to the third point, geopolitical environment surrounding the Korean Peninsula. We know that the US, United States, is pursuing TPP, and it wants not only Japan but also South Korea to join the TPP negotiation, to join this trade partnership. But meanwhile, South Korean government is very cautious and sometimes reluctant to join the TPP. Officially because it already has FTAs with many potential TPP members. But at the same time, in reality, South Korean government is concerned about the TPP looks like so-called encirclement or containment of China and containment policy toward China. Yes, in terms of national security or regional security, not only Tokyo, but also Seoul, South Korea welcomes US people to Asia. Prime Minister Abe visited United States, Washington, D.C. last week, and he expressed he wants stronger alliance with the United States. And Park Geun-hye, new President Park Geun-hye also needs stronger commitment of the US military in the region for the stable and safe transfer of operational control in 2015, especially given the situation after the North Korea's long-range missile launch and its nuclear test. But Seoul is anxious about the confrontation or so-called new Cold War between United States and China in East Asia, especially in Northeast Asia. And try to strike a balance between relationship with the United States and relationship with China. So we should understand that for South Koreans, China is not only the largest trade partner, but also important stakeholder in the future of the Korean Peninsula. China is an ally and a patron of North Korea, and more importantly, as a signatory of Korean War armistice in 1953. So in other words, China's endorsement is indispensable for the unification of the Korean Peninsula. Then, to ease this concern and strike a balance between the United States and China, Seoul has tried to exercise the initiative in the Trilateral cooperation among Japan, South Korea, and China, as Professor Terada mentioned. In 2010, the leaders from 3 countries agreed to Trilateral Cooperation Vision 2020, and the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat has established in 2011, in Seoul. And in this coming May, South Korean government, Park Geun-hye, have to host Trilateral Summit meeting in Seoul. So this will be a very important moment in the political, regional security affairs in the region, because on the sidelines of Trilateral Summit, bilateral summit between Japan and South Korea and Japan and China will be held. So based on the strong alliance with the United States, new South Korean government, Park Geun-hye, will pursue to build better relationship with China in order to boost its economy and to encourage China to take more initiative in North Korean problems, especially in denuclearization of North Korea, and to make progress in South Korea-China relations. FTA with China, bilateral FTA between China and South Korea, and also CJK Trilateral FTA will be the main tool for the South Korean administration.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Professor Nishino. And again, very fresh, his analysis. I'm very pleased to hear on the Ms. Park Ned's inauguration speech just 3 days ago, and prospect of the new approaches of the South Korean government to United States as well as the CJK, Japan and China. Well, my question to this is a bit comprehensive too. Again, I'm no specialist on South Korea, but I often say that South Korea is sandwiched by two major powers in Northeast Asia, China and Japan, but which allows South Korea to say a major key role is to bridge China and Japan. So in this case, CJK approach, but Trilateral cooperation, it's probably quite an adequate place in which the South Korea can play such kind of role. But on the other hand, it is often mentioned by Japanese media back in Tokyo recently that the Korea's inclination toward China become more obvious. That means the more significance could be placed on the relations with China compared with Japan. So in this case, I think bridging role can be more effectively exercised while keeping the so-called equal distance relationships with two major powers. But once South Korea is putting more energy, time, or emphasis on relations with China, how actually South Korean government is taking such kind of bridging role? So my question to you, Professor Nishino, is that how do you see the validity of this kind of the statement on bridging role? Do you think the new government is pursuing this kind of stuff or not? And if so, do you think the more strong emphasis on relations with China would allow South Korea to do it or not? Okay, now according to my watch, 11:15. The seminar actually started by 11:10, actually 10 minutes behind the schedule. Can I allow to have 10 minutes long? Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ishida. Say, yes, you can. Thank you. So, in this case, we have probably, 25 minutes, maybe more than that, for Q&A. So, I want to open the kind of session to the floor. So, if you want to say anything, maybe questions. So, how do you use the microphone? Okay, someone should come here all the way to raise your question. And please identify your name and affiliation before that, please. Okay, gentlemen, please.
My name is Louis Cohen. I'm a trade consultant here in town, ex of USJI back in the SII days. And I think Len Shop and I had some conversations about Toys R Us back in the day. But I was very struck by some of the points that each of the three of you made in terms of the domestic situation in the three countries involved. The rebalancing of the Chinese economy, the need in Korea to level the playing field between the cable and the small and medium-sized industries. The issues in Japan about structural adjustment, which we tried to address in SII, and 20 years later we're still trying to adjust them in the context of TPP. Maybe it will work this time. I'm beginning to lose hope, but you never know. Things can change. And the other point that you made in terms of, well, here we have all this network of FTAs filled with red tape, and 80% of the companies don't bother with them. We have a situation in which, countries are operating together, cooperating together to establish these agreements, but it's like the foam on the waves. Underneath, commerce is flowing, and will continue to flow because we have global supply chains. Governments being, sort of the barriers to the effective movement of goods and services across borders, and they don't want to give up their control very easily. So, given all of that, I'm just wondering to the three of you whether or not this network of negotiations that is going on now really matters in any economic sense, and whether or not the emphasis on the political balance and the security balance is really the overriding point that we should be concerned of. I know trade negotiators need jobs; they need to be able to negotiate. But And I always thought that really these trade negotiations were subsidies to hotels and restaurants in nice cities around the world. But I should stop there, but just to get your reaction.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can accept maybe a couple of questions first, then we can ask the panel to say something. Yes, please.
Okay, mine is fairly simple. I'm Ken Meyer, reporter at World Docs. Why is China not being invited into the discussions on the TPP at this time?
Very good. Okay, probably I can accept one more question. Okay, please, yes.
Mine's also going to be pretty quick. Lauren
You just identify yourself.
My name is Lauren Pewitz. I'm founder and editor of China Ag, which does market intelligence on China's agricultural economy. My question is basically, if possible, you speak about Japanese-Chinese agricultural investments in each other's country. I know there's been some pushback with Chinese investments on Hokkaido Island in terms of water resources. It's kind of a sensitive issue. But also at the same time, Japan is investing in the retail sector of southern China in terms of food markets. So if possible, can you speak on these type of investments?
Well, thank you very much. We have quite interesting three questions. And I hope the three individual speakers try to answer, well, including hopefully my own questions as well. Okay, let me start with
So let me start with Mr. Terada's question after my remarks about how Prime Minister Abe is going to handle the upper house elections and juggle getting involved in trade talks where he might have to make concessions that affect some of the major constituents of the party. So this has, of course, been the perennial, multi-decade reason why the Japanese government has not been able to really engage in multilateral trade liberalization that involves agriculture. Right? They've been able to do it in most other sectors of the economy, but in the area of agriculture, it's kind of been the no-touch zone for a very, very long time. So I think one reason, and of course, Abe, at the last election, I should mention that at the last election in December, a large number of LDP Diet members who won their elections in the lower house made commitments to keep Japan from giving away too much on agricultural issues during the TPP talks. So he has in his own party a lot of people who don't want to give up too much on agriculture. So, but for the foreseeable future, his main concern is not the people in his own party at the moment. He has 70% popularity rate for a party that lost disastrously in 2009 and had a series of prime ministers that were quite unpopular right before that. This is something the LDP has not had for a while, since Koizumi. So I don't think that he's worried too much about backbenchers in the lower house in his own party. He seems to be handling those pretty smoothly. But the voters at the upper house elections are more unpredictable. In previous upper house elections, the farm interests have shown themselves willing to turn against the LDP quite abruptly. 1989 was an example of this after the prime minister of that time. About 15 prime ministers ago. Who are we?
No.
No, before.
Takeshita.
Takeshita. After Takeshita had given away too much on beef and oranges and other sensitive agricultural issues, the farm voters turned abruptly against the LDP and were even willing to vote for the socialists. So, you know, it's hard to predict what the voters will do in the upper house election. But right now, there is Abe benefits from turmoil in the opposition ranks in the Japanese party system. The DPJ is really on the ropes with questions about whether it's even going to be able to survive now that it faced such a huge defeat in December and now has to try to fight back to establish itself as the leading alternative to the LDP. There are multiple alternatives to the LDP. Some of them, such as your party, Minna-no-to, are actually quite pro-TPP, pro-trade liberalization, and so they're not going to be picking up votes from Abe on this issue. So it's unpredictable, but compared to past upper house elections, I think Abe has a real chance of holding on to a lot of his voters, even while gingerly stepping in the direction of agricultural trade liberalization by joining the TPP talks. So, do trade talks matter? I think in one area of agriculture in Japan, they have potentially huge effects on that segment of the Japanese economy. Of course, it is now down to something like 1% of GDP accounted for by agriculture. And it maybe involves 2% of the people, heavily involved in agriculture as their primary source of income. So it's a relatively small sector, but it is symbolically, it's huge, and the trade barriers there are still massive. The rice tariff is 700 and something %. The wheat tariff is very high. There's still very high tariffs on beef, over 30%. So these are all areas where if the tariffs were lowered, much less agreed to improve coordination of regulatory standards, which is also on the agenda, you could see much sharper increase in imports of food in Japan and other agricultural products. And this could be a big improvement in the Japanese consumers' purchasing power. And once the consumers can spend less on food, they'll be able to buy more of other things, and this has spillover effects into other areas of the economy. So I think that's one example of a place where these trade deals could really matter. And of course, they're also negotiating over things like limits on state-owned enterprises that could affect the postal system in Japan and some other related sectors. So this connects with the question about why China hasn't joined the TPP. Let's see, the question came from the back corner. Yes, so because China still has such a large state-owned enterprise sector, a very powerful state-owned enterprise sector, the expectation would be that China would never be able to agree to the kinds of agreements that the rest of the countries want to reach in terms of a high-quality trade deal. Of course, other countries have some state-owned enterprises, including the United States. So it's not that they will be completely ruled out, but with the power of the state-owned enterprises and the opaqueness of the financial system in China and how it benefits, it seems to provide a backdoor subsidy to lots of industries. These kinds of issues are very hard to negotiate with China in a high-quality deal. And therefore, the strategy was to first make the deal without China and then invite them to come in. And I think most of the people involved in TPP have been open that they envision China being part of this eventually, if it comes to fruition, right? Which I have to be careful not to assume. And I'm going to pass on the Japan-China agricultural investments question because I don't know a whole lot about that.
Okay. Oh, thank you. I'm going to take them in a slightly different order. Your successors will have jobs. So trade agreements will continue to be negotiated, and I will take a slightly different but very similar approach to it. Trade negotiations are about setting the rules of game for international trade. That's why they matter. And that's why TPP matters to the United States. It's a U.S. structured model. We are currently engaged in a negotiation process with several other countries that at this time, to a degree, are willing to accept that. Although my understanding of the negotiations, we're getting a lot more pushback than we had back in the day when you were part of the negotiation. So what will come out in the TPP may be a little bit different than course or what we've seen previously. And yes, there is, from USTR and from the Obama administration, this 21st century gold, platinum, or whatever standard that they ascribe to. But I wouldn't necessarily say that all the members of the ongoing TPP negotiations share the same vision that the U.S. has on that matter. So, but yes, your imagery was good in terms of sort of the froth on top of the sea of activity that's going on. But we are operating in an international arena where we tend to look to our governments to deal with what we think are unfairness or inequities about what has happened. And to that extent, you're always going to have governments involved in negotiating international trade agreements. What's interesting, I think, in this day and age is that there's almost a complete abandonment of the WTO multilateral approach, and that we're getting this piecemeal approach, and that's a whole other discussion. On China and TPP, I'll give you a slightly different interpretation. They are free to request consideration for joining at any time they wish. That's how TPP operates. It is up to the existing parties in negotiation to decide whether or not they want to accept an application. So they don't have to be invited. They can ask if they can join. So far, they have not done so. Now, speculation on why they have decided not to join, we can get into a larger discussion. But I believe there was actually a direct situation where a Chinese representative said, why haven't we been invited to join? And very quickly the US representative said, because you don't have to be invited. What you can do is ask and we will consider your application. The application to join the negotiation process has to be approved by all the existing parties in the negotiation. And that is in some ways one of the problems that Prime Minister Abe in Japan is dealing with, is effectively providing sufficient reassurances to the existing negotiators that they can negotiate in good faith with the terms of the agreement that's been agreed to date. That's been sort of the approach that TPP negotiators have taken. So on that. Moving now to your question. On the renminbi and the swap agreements and arrangements that have been set up, and there are now other aspects. They're negotiating with London to designate a clearinghouse in London where you could directly exchange pounds for renminbi. Real quickly, I think China is doing this primarily, and I sort of alluded to all of them, but I didn't say it quite clearly. One, foreign exchange risk. You export foreign exchange risk so long as trade is being done in your currency. It's very simple. And not just in terms of settlement, but if you can actually get the contracts written in your currency, which is an interesting phenomenon. There's a lot of international trade not involving the United States, where the contract, the agreement, is actually written in US dollars, even though payment may not be done in US dollars, but it's denominated in that. So that's the first part. Second, I think the greater utilization of renminbi in China's mind means that its role as a sort of major hub or center for the trade dynamics of the region is reinforced. So long as you have this outside US dollar, and in their mind, outside US dollar playing that role, it weakens China's potential position. And third, and I sort of alluded to this, they don't trust US policymakers on economic and monetary policy to do what's in the best interest of China, and perhaps not even the world, in terms of what they do. And the extent to which they can, in a particular arena, supplant the US dollar with the renminbi, then they in some ways buffer or protect their own economy and their regional economic dynamics from the undesired influences of the Federal Reserve, US Congress, US administration. And I too, on the Chinese Japanese agricultural investment, I have not been following that for 20 years. I used to follow that, but I have not been following it much of late, so I can't really comment on that question. My apologies.
question. So regrettably for Japanese, we must recognize that the shadow of China is becoming bigger in South Korea in every arena. And but when I had the opportunity to talk with foreign ministry high-level official in Seoul last week, they expressed, interestingly, they expressed concern that Japanese media criticize South Korea's leaning toward China. For them, Japan is still important partner, more than China. But problem is the public opinion of South Korea. So there was a territorial dispute. There had been territorial dispute since 1950 or 1945. But at that time, during Cold War period, Japanese and South Korean government could share this issue because of Cold War structure and South Korean political structure before democratization. But after the democratization of South Korea, we should address more sincerely historical issue between Japan and South Korea. But regrettably, still we have serious cleavage or serious difference in opinion of territorial issue. So this is the fundamental problem for me. But so as to bridging role of South Korea between Japan and China, yes, there is a limit in bridging role between China and Japan. But as I mentioned in my remarks, South Korea is trying to actively to take initiative in Trilateral cooperation, CJK cooperation, in very functional approach manner. So in this approach, we cannot resolve serious conflict in security arena, but we can envision future East Asian community in the very long term. So this is a good point. So I expect South Korea is continuing to exercise this law. And as to FTA negotiation, from South Korean perspective, as I mentioned in my remarks, new government, new Park Geun-hye administration is basically pursue FTA negotiation in many countries, but Park Geun-hye by herself is really cautious to pursue negotiation without consideration towards domestic economic structure. So for Park Geun-hye, it is very important to encourage small and medium businesses in her nation. In this context, maybe powerful negotiation of South Korea will disappear under her presence.
All right, thank you very much. It's, well, 11:40. I want to finish this seminar at 15 to 12. So if you want to ask, okay, give two more, okay, lady first.
Very nerve-wracking, walking down that aisle. I'm Sheila Gagota with the Wilson Center. I wanted to ask about TPP as a force for social change and not just an economic instrument. Professor Sherpa talked about the seemingly Achilles heel of Abenomics, namely structural reform or lack thereof of a comprehensive plan. To what extent would Japan joining TPP at whatever stage be a force that gaiatsu, that external pressure that will push Japan to bring about change? And does the timing of Japan joining matter as a force to bring about that kind of change? That's one question. And another question for Professor Martin. One of China's problems that it really dearly wants to be is a soft power, that it is not simply an economic or military force, that it becomes a country that inspires, that it becomes an aspirational country. By not being part of TPP, being excluded from that arena, it is not being part of that community. Is there much talk within China about China offering something, not beyond the Japan-South Korea, Japan trilateral agreement, but an alternative universe, so to speak, of a global or a pan-Asian free trade agreement that China can lead?
Yeah, thank you very much. Final question, yes, please.
Thank you. It's a long way from the next seat here. I'm Konrad Mazierz from the Polish Embassy, but I'm speaking for myself here. I would like to ask for a kind of clarification, because from your presentation, my understanding of the topic is something like that the main stakeholder of TPP negotiations are United States. It's a key element of US policy of pivot to Asia. It's actually a key element of success of US rebalancing towards Asia. But it seems from your set that it's totally different in the region. That for the countries like South Korea, Japan, and China, I mean, TPP is only a small portion of a very big picture. For China, China promotes its interests for global policy. For South Korea, more important are relations with China. And all these countries in the region have many other options of regional economic integration. Is my understanding correct from what you say about this general picture? And if it's so do you think it's realistic to expect completion of TPP negotiation before the end of this year? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, yeah, Vera and
yeah, it's interesting to think about what could finally change the Japanese kind of perspective towards their economy, towards embracing a more market-oriented, the idea that trade liberalization could actually be good for consumers and would actually improve standards of living in the country. And I'm a little disappointed with the media coverage I'm reading in Japan about the latest Abe statement that he brought home for Washington, and that the scorekeeping still seems to be about how little can Japan give away on its national interest in its key treasured sectors. And so if the approach towards the TPP by the Japanese government continues to be, let's hold out to give away as little as possible on things like agricultural trade, I don't think that social change is really going to happen. So it'll be really interesting to see if at some point, maybe after the upper house election, the Abe cabinet and others in his administration start speaking about the actual benefits of this trade deal for the Japanese economy, how productivity increases are critical for Japan's economic strategy going forward, and really selling the deal as something that's good for Japan rather than as something it has to give into because of the United States is dragging it into this organization. Of course, that relates to your question, right? is it really a bunch of reluctant Asian countries with the United States dragging them into these talks? It doesn't hold out much hope that this is going to come to an easy or timely resolution. And I think that it would be a mistake to assume that all the parties in these talks are quite as reluctant as Japan is, right? Some of them were founding partners. Countries like New Zealand and Australia and Canada and Mexico, more recent additions, and Chile are all kind of on board with a liberalization agenda. The greater challenge is going to be to get the East Asian countries, the core of East Asia, to make that same shift that I just mentioned for the Japanese case. And it seems like a few of the countries are really shifting in that direction in Southeast Asia. But I think we will have to see whether the Japanese also seize this moment to make that shift.
Let me see if I can successfully wed the two questions together because they're somewhat related. A little bit of history would be helpful in sort of at least to me, in understanding the dynamic. You had the earlier version of the TPP, which was Brunei, Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. Now, why those four countries came together is a whole other discussion, but they did create an entity with a vision of a larger regional cross-Pacific trade association based on sort of a common understanding of what the rules of the road should be. So that has existed for a number of years. I don't remember when it started. CJK, for example, the idea's been around for at least a decade. It's not brand new. It's gotten a little more life of late, but it's been around for a while. ASEAN, the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, are also forming a joint economic entity with the goal of having it completed in 2015. And a couple of presenters that I've heard recently said that the revitalization of the CJK is sort of a parallel structure development. That is to say, ASEAN coordinates itself, CJK coordinates, and then those two entities can merge. I mentioned earlier you had the ASEAN plus 3, which is the CJK, and then the ASEAN plus 6, which would be India, Australia, and New Zealand as well. So in terms of alternative, yes, China has been part of an alternative in the region for a number of years. One could say before the new TPP concept came around. And so that's part of the argument that some make, that the TPP is the US response to initiatives in the region that would have left them out. That isn't necessarily what all of Asia agrees or everyone agrees to. So you have that kind of dynamic. If my comments about TPP seem somewhat internally contradictory, yes, because I think the situation is internally contradictory. You had this existing entity. It had this vision. The United States announced that it was interested in joining the existing entity, but kind of that is to say, we may scrap all of the document and start all over, but we want to be part of it. Other countries joined in for various reasons at the time. But what I alluded to is that the nature of the dynamics of the negotiations that are going on right now is a little bit different than past negotiations where the USTR has been there and directly involved. There's been a number of areas where what the United States offered on the table wasn't necessarily picked up or embraced with much enthusiasm. Interesting enough, agricultural trade is a serious issue for the United States as well. And this gets to the final part of the question. I don't have a crystal ball, so I cannot predict whether or not it'll be done this year. But what I would frame it is this way. There are domestic U.S. concerns having to do with TPP in the possible agreement that would come out of it that will impinge on the places of a number of vested interests economically in the United States. And so there are constraints domestically, economically, politically, as well as within Congress that will form what is in the realm of viable TPP agreements. If you think of it as a big Venn diagram, there's this sphere of viable TPP agreements for the United States. Then you have these other countries that have their own little spheres. The question is there going to be sufficient overlap in the time frame that they've set up to come out with something that can then separately go back to each of the countries and pass the political review process? And if I may, your comment about the idea of Japan joining in the process, that's why there's been this sort of this understanding, like, if you're joining this moving train of negotiations, you got to accept where we are now. We can't go back and rewrite chapters that have been agreed to. And that is a constraint on new parties joining. So.
Well, thank you very much. And well, I believe we have a quite fruitful and also beneficial seminar this morning. And three of the distinguished speakers touched upon the domestic politics, its relevance to the economic policies, even on the relations with the United States, China, Japan, South Korea. Putting all of them together, again, I cannot summary, of course, I cannot make any summary on that, obviously. But I think what we can probably say at the moment is the all economic issues surrounding the CJK as well as the United States are also linked up to some security and defense issues, and which we focus on tomorrow. So if you're interested in this kind of issues, particularly linkage between economic and political and security agendas, so please come back tomorrow, I think this room, I guess. And on again, CJK, but different field of areas. One thing, particularly someone asked agriculture, and also I came back to the on that kind of issues. Well, rice, clearly, focused on. Okay, rice is infamous because it has the nearly 800% tariff ratio, so it's almost embargo. But I'm not so sure that whether rice can be a major issue in the TPP negotiations. In this case, Japan and the United States can be more cooperative. I know it sounds contradictory, but looking back to the U.S. areas of exclusion from the liberalization, sugars and dairy products, those two issues also Japan put to the very high tariff ratios. So if the United States wants to keep those items being excluded from trade liberalization issues, not only for TPP, any other the trade negotiation which the United States may come to join, I think that would be very welcome to Japan. So in this case, someone in the Japanese government mentioned that there are currently a number of 17 or 18 the individual items of category of rice. Which kind of category of rice could be sacrificed? But that's very interesting, the items. In terms of the details of TPP negotiation, particularly in terms of Japan's potential participation, that will also help for, I think, South Korea again. So agriculture, as I think Mike mentioned, it's sensitive to most of the nations and TPP member countries. And maybe Australia is the exception. And of course, so in this case, and Australia is very much concerned about Japan following the same kind of the agricultural policy approach the United States actually using for first US-Australia FTA as well as TPP. So this is probably something which we have to keep eyes on, particularly in face of the coming election in Japan. And after that, I'm not so sure, but I'm quite hoping that Mr. Abe will take some measures, step for agricultural reforms, so that the people are not necessarily happy with Japan joining TPP to be passed by with. So this is more political domestic agendas. And I think we can come back to this kind of issue in the USJI event in the near future. Again, thank you very much for your participation.